Without further ado, I would like to introduce Sara Hobolt to you, our distinguished speaker today. Sara Hobolt holds the Sutherland Chair in European Institutions and is professor at the Department of Government at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She is a fellow of the British Academy, affiliated with Nuffield College, Oxford, the University of Southern Denmark, and previously Sara held positions at Oxford as well as the University of Michigan. Sara has published 5 books and more than 60 research articles, for which she has won numerous prizes, so many that I can't list them here. But perhaps my personal favorite, I will briefly mention. In 2011, Sara made history as the first ever non-US based recipient of the American Political Science Association's Emerging Scholar Award for her work in the area of elections, public opinion, and voting behavior. Sara started her career with a very European EU-related topic, writing, one can say today, really the book on referendums on European integration. And that was, you may believe it or not, well, a decade before Brexit, before anyone was thinking about referendums on European integration, making her now, during the last years, one of the most sought after experts in British politics. But Sara's work is not at all confined to the EU. In fact, she belongs to this precious circle of experts that we have in political science who have opened our eyes on an endless amount of general questions, using Europe as an example for much broader phenomena. How do voters attribute responsibility in politics? What happens to democratic attitudes of citizens when political choice is constrained? When and how do political cultures become polarized? Sara has provided us with the answers on many of these questions and many more fundamental questions. Today, she will talk to us on yet another of these big questions. How do new parties compete against established ones? Her book with Catherine De Vries, Political Entrepreneurs, The Rise of Challenger Parties in Europe, is a tour de force through general theories of party competition that helps us understand much better why we see so many party systems in Europe fundamentally being transformed during the last years, while others are resilient to change. Sara, we are very excited to have you here with us today, and we are very much looking forward to hear more about party competition. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that all too kind introduction. I was hoping you would mention the prize we'd won together as your favorite. But anyway, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much to you and to the UCL for inviting me here today. It's an honor to be here. I would have liked to be there in person to discuss these important topics, but we will do it this way. And that is also a pleasure. So as Chris was saying, what I will talk about today is the rise of challenger parties in Europe. And I have a few slides that I would like to share with you. So let me go ahead and do that now. So I hope you can see those. As you see here, this is really the title of this talk, but also of the book that I have published recently with Catherine De Vries, who's professor at the University of Bocconi, is Political Entrepreneurs, The Rise of Challenger Parties in Europe. And this is really a book where we try to look at post-war phenomenon where we have had very stable coalitions of mainstream parties in government and also dominating parliaments across Europe to this decline of the mainstream. We talk a lot about decline of social democracy, but we also see the decline of the center-right in many countries, and the rise, on the other hand, of populist parties, of green parties, of radical right-wing parties, of single-issue parties, and so on. Here, just a few examples, both in the center, on the left, and on the right. We've focused a lot in the commentary and also in the literature on the radical right, but there are other kinds of challenger parties like the Five Star Movement in Italy, Podemos in Spain, and so on. And before I get too far into this talk and talking about challenger parties and how Catherine and I seek to explain this rise of challengers, I would like us to collectively, as a group, think a bit about what is an example of a successful challenger party. I'm sure that here in the audience today, we have expertise from across the world, certainly from across Europe. So before we start, also so I can sort of tailor my examples accordingly, I think that Chris is going to come up with show us a little poll that's posted, I think, in the chat. Is that right? And then we can just start off by seeing what is an example of a successful challenger party in Europe, really in the post-war period.
Yeah, great. You should now see in the chat, I don't know if you can see it, but it should be in the chat, a link which directly takes you to this poll. Otherwise, I would urge everyone to go on menti.com if you don't see the link. And on menti.com, you can just use the code 5927717 and can submit your idea of a successful challenger party. And we already have 2 people who have registered something, but I will wait for a few more responses before we show the results. So it would be really great.
I also see someone here in the chat saying SNP, which is in fact in our operationalization that I will come back to, is a challenger party, although of course it's very much also a dominant party in Scotland. But it's one of these parties that are interesting in the sense that they've certainly brought, they've engaged in what we call issue entrepreneurship, in taking an issue that's quite hard for mainstream parties in England to deal with, namely that of Scottish independence. Others have mentioned. So here we have quite a few examples. En Marche is an interesting one. Indeed, it is, of course, a party that was a challenger, and according to how we look at it, didn't remain one for long, became a dominant force in French politics. With other examples, AFD and UKIP are, of course, parties that have remained challenger parties in that they've remained outside government. Fidesz. So Fidesz is not, according to how we look at it, a challenger party. It might be a radical right-wing party, according to some definitions, a populist party, but it is very much a dominant party in terms of government power and vote share. So Syriza, so Five Star Movement, Lega Nord, and the National Rally. Again, in terms of, so challenger parties, and I'll come back to the justification for why. So we look at challenger parties in terms of their market power, and we operationalize that in terms of whether or not they've had government experience. And therefore, Syriza and the Five Star Movement started off as challengers and, of course, became dominant governing parties, as did Lega Nord, but not the National Rally in France. Whereas others, UKIP, the Brexit Party, AFD that I've seen here, all have remained successful, but nonetheless still challenger parties. So these are great examples, and it gives me a good starting point to, I think, go on with and talk a little bit more about how we explain this dynamic between challengers and dominant parties. So thank you so much for engaging in this. Let me return to my screen here, and thank you for engaging in this little exercise here.
One small thing to everyone: you can keep the survey open because we will have one other question later. So just keep the tab open.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So so one thing that's interesting, if you look at party politics over time, is that we focus a lot on change, and that was indeed the starting point here, as you can see, of my talk, and also the starting point for this book was really one on focusing on change. But in the end, we wrote a book about both continuity and change. And part of the motivation of that is really in this graph, which plots party families over time in the last 100 years in West European politics. And as you can see, these big blue and red and yellow blocks here are the conservative Christian Democrats, and blue, the red, the Social Democrats, Labour parties, and the yellow are the Liberals. And what we see here is not primarily perhaps a picture of fractionalization, but very much one on continuity. You do see that in the last decade or so, there have been a bit more change in terms of new party families emerging as a stronger force, both on the radical left, the radical right, and in the Greens. So some of these parties that you mentioned, some of them are also you could call single issue parties like UKIP or the Brexit Party. But they are also represented here. But it's interesting to see really that if you want to give an account and try and understand what has happened in European politics in the last 100 years, just focusing on the last 10 years of change and just focusing on the radical right really doesn't do it justice. There was another interesting empirical observation that was an inspiration for our theory and our book, and that was that there's really huge variation across countries in when challenger parties emerge. So myself, I'm originally from Denmark, and challenger parties there on the radical right really came on the scene seriously in the early 1970s already. And a lot of the literature you read today on the radical right, you would think that it was a very recent phenomenon. In other countries, so my co-author Catherine is from the Netherlands, it only really became a powerful force in Dutch politics in the 1990s, but have of course remained so ever since. And so there's a lot of variation in when these parties emerge on the scene. And that made us think that a lot of accounts of changes to European party politics are very structural. In other words, they tend to focus on these big changes to the political economy of countries. Deindustrialization, for example, as an explanatory variable, as a way of explaining why we've seen the rise of the radical right and of challenger parties. But if that's the case, we thought then why do we see so much cross-national variation? So really what we try to do is address three different questions. One is not just to focus on the change, but also to focus on the continuity. Why have mainstream party families been so resilient in post-war Europe despite the major structural changes that have occurred in the post-war period? And what explains why some challenger parties have been successful? Because indeed, most of the challenger parties we focus on, and they are not the ones mentioned in your list because they were not the successful ones. So they're a bit like firms that most challenger parties pop up and never really make it. And finally, we'll come to that at the very end of this talk. What have been the effects on government and representation more generally? So the theoretical starting point we take is one of industrial organization. And you might think, well, depending on your particular sort of approach to European politics, you might either think that's a bit odd, or, well, we already know that, that party politics is a bit like economics. So why do we focus specifically on industrial organization? Well, one is that we really use this as an analogy because we think of the development, political change in Europe as a struggle between dominance and innovation in the marketplace. So in that first striking graph, you really saw the dominance with these big mainstream party groupings that have dominated. But there's also innovation in the form of challenger parties. Where we depart from some of the existing dominant theories of party competition, most notably we know the Downsian spatial theory of party competition, is that we argue that really when it comes to party competition, it is imperfect competition. What I mean by that is you can't simply pop up as a party and say, hey, I'm going to place myself here where the median voter is, and then I'm going to attract the most votes. That would be the logical consequences of sort of simple Downsian model. Think Change UK, was that one of the names they had, or the Tiggers, the independent group, or whatever they were called. You know, in a sense, you could argue they were pretty median in terms of preferences at the time, and they were not successful at all. And one of the reasons is that there are very high barriers to entry in most party systems, some of them in the form of electoral systems that we know from the UK, but also others that I will come back to. And the third insight that we take from industrial organization is really one of focusing on the agency of the innovative strategies of entrepreneurs. So it's not just a structural, or it's not even primarily a structural explanation of why we see these underlying changes. It's one where there's really a focus on the agency. And that's important because structural explanations do help us to understand why there's been a weakening of this oligopoly that we think that mainstream dominant parties have engaged in. but they don't explain when or why certain challenger parties become successful. So what we try to do is complement that large literature that focuses on these structural changes with an emphasis on the role of political parties as actors. And again, we see them as actors that trade their products, and we see this political product as a combination between your policy stances, but also your ability to implement those policies, so your competence, and they trade that in exchange of votes. One important difference that I'm just going to highlight from the start between the economic market and the political market is that if you go and buy a car, you can buy it regardless of whether it's a small, tiny company and it's a big company. When you go and buy a government, or you vote for someone because you want a policy, you only really get that policy delivered if your party gets into government. And that's important to keep in mind when we think about how we think about dominance in the political market. We argue that the dominant parties are those that dominate the marketplace through their control of government power, exactly because of this, the way in which you can deliver a product in a political market, while challengers are those parties that do not yet have dominance within the political system, that have not yet held government power. And political change, as we see it, is this result of this tug of war between dominance. So how able are dominant parties or mainstream parties in holding on to their position, and how skilled are the entrepreneurs, the challengers at innovating. So that's the sort of grand frame that we introduce. And let me just sort of quickly walk you through the argument, and then I will present some examples and some evidence. So the starting point, as I mentioned, because our starting point is one that borrows from this idea of industrial organization, that we don't have a free market. The political market is an oligopoly, and that means that there are a few players that dominate. It means that they help set the rules of the game. One obvious example is electoral systems, but there are also less institutional and more psychological barriers to entry for new entrants, one being the loyalty of voters, or we often think of it, party attachments. So you don't just, in most systems, people don't simply shift between parties every election like they might shift between margarine and butter. Instead, they have certain loyalties and expectations built up over the years of certain parties. Moreover, there's also strategies of dominant parties to protect that dominance that I will come back to. The second part of our argument, and that's very much borrowing from this large literature on structural change in European politics, is that this oligopoly is weakening. So voters are increasingly acting as critical consumers. They are not as attached to parties as they once were. And that opens up new possibilities for innovation and for political entrepreneurs to enter and to break down this oligopoly. And this is where challenger parties come in. Once there is a weakening of the attachment of voters, of this sort of, oh, I've always been a social democrat, my dad was a social democrat, my granddad was a social democrat, so of course I'm going to vote for them. Once there's a weakening of that attachment, then challenger parties can attack the oligopoly through innovation. And they will do this, we argue, through two ways of innovating. One we call policy innovation, and that is not primarily about simply shifting closer to the median voter, which would be the sort of classic Downsian model. Instead, it's really about introducing new issues that voters care about, but that drive a wedge within the existing coalitions. So we've seen that in the UK with the EU issue, which has really become a new issue that was very hard for the dominant parties to handle. Now in the UK, that didn't lead to a breakdown of the oligopoly because we have such high barriers, institutional barriers to entry because of the electoral system. But in other countries in Europe, we've seen these wedge issues like the EU, like immigration, like the green issue, really being an advantage for these issue entrepreneurs. Another form of innovation is rhetorical innovation. And we think about that as this anti-establishment rhetoric. That is, of course, a key component of populism, as we know. And it's a way in which you undermine the advantage that mainstream parties have by simply saying, well, we are competent, we know how to get this done. And by saying, well, the whole establishment is corrupt, it's not with us, challenger parties can break through that oligopoly. And then very final part of the argument is, what are then the consequences of those changes for the political system and for representation? And one is that you have a party system that is fragmenting, and we see that in many European countries, and that of course has several outcomes in terms of how difficult it becomes to form governments, how stable those governments become, but it also can have potentially some positive outcomes for representation. Now let me sort of give you a bit of an example, an analogy here from from industry and from firms. So each of the chapters in our book starts off with an example of how an analogy from the world of industry. And one here that I particularly like, because I'm old enough to have had one of these Nokia phones here. I'm sure most of you in the audience have not had that, but I remember the days when all the rage was having a Nokia phone, and they were like seen as and they really dominated the market. Nowadays, I have one of these phones here, and they are also quite dominant on the market. But the interesting thing is that Nokia was really innovative in terms of what they did. They had an internal antenna, they had like cool snake games on the phone. Everyone needed a Nokia, and they were far ahead. Now, what Apple did was they came out, I think the first time was in 2007, they came out with this new smartphone, a touchscreen. It doesn't mean Nokia actually came out, I think, the year later with a similar phone, but by then there was already massive first mover advantage for Apple. They were seen as the phone to go to if you wanted this new kind of phone, and Nokia never managed to catch up, despite having absolutely dominated the mobile phone market, never managed to catch up. Now, so if we go back to Schumpeter, I know Schumpeter has gotten a sort of a bad name because it's apparently like Dominic Cummings' favorite political theorist, but Schumpeter, he had this idea of creative destruction. So this was this idea that through innovation you create economic change, but that there's always this tug of war on the one hand between the dominant players that try to keep their advantage in the market, and on the other hand through these innovators that come in and try and take over. And today, of course, Apple are very much the dominant players. And similarly, with the way we look at dominant and challenger parties, you need not stay a challenger party forever. Indeed, we have this tug of war where eventually some challengers become dominant. And as I already alluded to, dominant parties, as we see it, are those parties that dominate the political marketplace, and we operationalize that as government experience, because government experience is really essential to how you are able to deliver the product and dominate in a political market, unlike in an economic market where you can simply sell enough of your product. It's not enough just to get votes if you want to deliver those products. You also have to have government power or influence. Challenger parties, in contrast, then, in the sort of binary way, are those parties that do not yet have dominance within the political system. So in the book, we treat this both as a binary thing, because we think there's a sort of important qualitative difference between the strategies that these types of parties employ. And I will come back to that. But we also have more continuous measures that, in a sense, there can be degrees of dominance. So if you're the CDU in Germany, you're very dominant. Yeah, you've been in power for a long time. You cannot employ the sort of challenger party strategies that I will mention. On the other hand, you can be the Green Party that used to be the predominant really challenger party, but of course has been in government for a long time in Germany, and now would be classified as a dominant party, but is less so perhaps than the CDU. So we deal both with a binary and a more continuous approach to this. For the sake of simplicity, I'll keep talking about this as a sort of binary concept, which is also what we do in most of the book. So let's start with the dominant parties. So they have certain tools at their disposal. First of all, they have this, they have a sort of classic Downsian tool that they can employ in order to in order to keep their voters, and that is to become what we can think of as catch-all parties. You go in the center, you try and get as many votes as possible. You remain a little bit distinct as a center-right or center-left. You don't want to sort of leapfrog around, but nonetheless, you try and offer policies that fit the taste of most voters while still appearing distinct from competitors. And one of the things we can see if we look at expert data or manifesto data is that if we track the major center-left and center-right parties, as we've done in these two graphs here with manifesto data of Germany and the UK, we see that's indeed what the major parties, Western European dominant parties, have done. Of the center-right and the center-left, they are quite centrist in their policy positions, although we can always have certain outliers, but generally they have remained on their side of the aisle. So they need to remain distinct in terms of their identity, but still be catch-all enough to be able to appeal to a large proportion of the electorate. But there's also other things they can do. So the catch-all party, it's quite well known, but there are other things that dominant parties can do as well. One is to keep on campaigning on the issues that made them dominant in the first place. In Europe, that tends to be issues to do with standard left-right economic issues, to do with the role of the state in the economy, redistribution, and so on. And those are the issues that, in a sense, keep their coalitions together. And on the other hand, they want to keep wedge issues, as we call them, off the agenda. So issues like immigration and the EU that are much harder for them to handle, that's where their coalition of voters do not necessarily hold the same preferences. So that's one set of strategies that we also see some evidence of, that generally mainstream parties tend to want to focus more on the economy than challenger parties. Another thing that dominant parties do a lot is to focus on highlighting their political experience and ability to govern. And when we look at survey data, we do see that mainstream parties are generally, and dominant parties are generally seen as more competent on the most important issues. So while people might share some of the preferences of challenger parties when it comes to competence, mainstream dominant parties tend to win out. Now, that's been quite relevant recently in this COVID crisis. I'm happy to talk about that later in the Q&A, because indeed what we saw in the beginning of the crisis was a quite big jump in the popularity of dominant parties across Europe, and especially incumbent parties. And I think one of the reasons for that is when you have a massive public health crisis like COVID, the COVID-19 pandemic, what happens is people really want parties that deliver, you know, and they want competence, and that is still where dominant parties tend to have an advantage. Now, as I said, the second step, though, is that while dominant parties have these strategies at their disposal, this oligopoly that meant that voters almost sort of automatically would vote for either center-right or center-left dominant party, that is weakening. A key thing here is not massive changes to electoral systems. They are rare, as we know, but they are instead a weakening of party attachments. They don't happen at the same rate across Europe, but generally we have seen a weakening of people's sort of feeling of closeness or psychological attachments to parties. And that is important because it has behavioral consequences. It means that people are more likely to switch from one party to another. So here it's a plot of voter volatility. So it's basically what is the percentage of the electorate that switch from election A to election B in terms of not voting for the same party. So you can see in Denmark it's very high. You know, most voters tend to vote for another party. In Germany it's a lot lower in the time period here, although it probably is increasing. In the Netherlands, it's fairly high. In Sweden and the UK, in Sweden, it's also an increase. In the UK, less so. And there are good, important strategic reasons for that. Even if people are unhappy, as we've seen, we still have very much two-party dominance, and the electoral system here, I think, is crucial to explain that. What about challenger parties? They really have an opportunity to innovate when voters become more like critical consumers, because they can say, well, now we have a chance to try and break this monopoly. But what we argue is it's not the best way of breaking this monopoly is not to say, oh, let's just, you know, talk about the same issues and go a bit closer to the median voter. Instead, what they often try and do is they are successful through policy innovation by raising new issues that were not previously, that are not the dominant issues. So in other words, they're not the sort of standard left-right economic issues. So in the book, we look at 3 so-called wedge issues that are not neatly aligned with the left-right issue. We argue the environment, European integration, and immigration. But you can think of a range of other wedge issues that in other contexts might equally fit the bill. And what we see is that here, when we look at both when we look at CMP data and when we look at CHESS data, what we see is that challenger parties are much more likely to talk about these wedge issues than dominant parties are. So they engage in this, we call this issue entrepreneurship. Now, what we also find is that voters for challenger parties, and here I'm not making any kind of causal argument about what causes what, but we do see that voters for challenger parties are also more likely to think that these issues are important when they vote than voters of mainstream dominant parties. So in other words, we see that voters of challenger parties are more likely to put greater emphasis on immigration issues and on the EU issue, and not quite significant with the environment issue. One of the reasons being that some of these green parties that used to be challengers now indeed are classified as dominant parties. The other main strategy that we say challenger parties have is that of anti-establishment rhetoric. Again, we know it's a core component of populist rhetoric, not the only one, but a core part. And we do 2 things in the book. We look at sort of CHESS data to see that, or the experts think that challenger parties are more likely to emphasize anti-establishment rhetoric, and we find that's the case. But we also do our own analysis using machine learning techniques of manifestos, and again, we see that consistently challenger parties uses more anti-establishment rhetoric. And that's a way of trying to get at that competence advantage that the incumbent have. Because if incumbent and dominant parties can always go around to say, yeah, well, we'll deliver for you, then it's very hard for challenger parties to really make inroads. But if they can say, well, this whole political class, they're all, corrupt and useless, then it might open the eyes, and that would be a way of appealing to voters and gaining and trying to undermine this oligopoly. So we then have these 2 principles of political change that says, when is it, under what conditions do we get political change? Under what conditions do we get inroads into the oligopoly where the dominance of the mainstream parties is undermined? And the first principle is that of contestability. So if you have very sticky market share, so in other words, it's very hard for voters to really to change their minds, either because of high barriers to entry in forms of electoral rules or because of high levels of party attachment, then you're unlikely to see political change because very few votes are contested. And but that, as we've seen, can change if you have this weakening of loyalties in the system. The second principle is that of appropriability. So that's, again, a concept for industrial organization. A high appropriability issue is an issue where you can go in and you can actually make economic gains and you can capture the benefits of innovation. Now, what you might do in the economic market is you can say, you can put a patent on something. You can say, I invented this, and that's a very good way of reaping the benefits of your innovation. Well, you can't do that in the political market. You can't say, well, I was the first really anti-immigration party, now no one else is allowed to be it. So it's harder to really reap the gains of your innovation as a political party because you're always going to get copycats. On the other hand, what there's increasing evidence showing is that voters still give some benefit to the first mover in the political market. In other words, if you really want a Green Party in Germany, you might vote for the Greens and not vote for, let's say, the SPD that all of a sudden think, oh, we're also a bit green. Or if you really want an anti-immigration party, you might vote for the AfD and not the CSU, even if they make sort of anti-immigration overtures. So there is a certain first mover advantage there. And this increased appropriability can also come through external development. So, for example, if you have external shocks like refugee flows or a financial crisis, some high appropriability issues will also be more salient, and that means they'll matter more to voters. So we argue that this combination, if you have high contestability and high appropriability, then that's when you're really likely to see political change. I should say, in terms of the contestability, you can also have sort of extreme examples of a massive corruption scandal amongst the dominant parties like you had in Italy in the early 1990s. And again, that really undermines the dominance and opens up for innovation amongst challengers. Now, Chris was saying we have another question because for all of you, and I'm not sure I have an answer to that, but I would like your views on it. And this is really this issue. What we try to do in the book is mainly chart these changes that have happened in European politics with the rise of challengers. And we also, we try to explain when challengers are successful or not. But I guess a big question for all of us is, well, how does that matter for democracy? You know, is it, when we think of industrial organization literature, often they will think, well, innovation is a good thing. It's a good thing to get new players on the market. It's a good thing to have replacement of who's dominant. Maybe it was a good thing that Apple took over from Nokia. We got cooler phones and so on. But is it the same? Like, can we think of it the same way when it comes to democracy? So I would like your views, and then on that, and then I can continue and try and present some of the ways in which we try to look at the question empirically.
Yeah, so for those that haven't registered yet, you can just use the link in the chat, or if you don't find that, then you go on www.menti.com and use the code 5927717, the code here, and then you can vote. We will keep voting open for another 30 seconds, and then we will see the results.
Exciting. Well, that's interesting. So most people think either it's made no difference or it's strengthened democracy. So I wonder sometimes whether this question is, whether the answer to these questions depend on, you know, who you have in mind when you think of challengers, whether we think it's good or bad. But we try to, so this is fascinating. So it's not quite a normal distribution, but almost, but certainly it's a bit skewed towards that we think this is a good thing for democracy. Innovation, having new parties enter on the scene, new issues is a good thing. Okay, so that's fascinating. So let me say a bit about how, so as a sort of empirical political scientist, I'm always very reluctant to take these sort of normative stances. So instead we try to think about, okay, what might be the kind of effects we should look at. So what economists do, they'd like to think about in terms of sort of efficiency. What's efficiency in democracy? But we looked at two things. We looked at government stability, because we could think it's important for democracy to have governments that can deliver, be formed, but also in terms of representation. And let me just share the screen with you, and I will show you some of our evidence on that. So the first thing to note is, of course, what happens with the rise of challengers is market fragmentation. Again, you might think that's good. We break down this oligopoly, we have new blood in, we have new parties with new ideas. However, it poses certain challenges, and we focused on two things. And of course, there's lots of things you can look at and I would be interested in. But what we did in the book is we looked at two things. We looked at the ability of new governments to form, and we find it generally takes longer. And we've seen lots of examples of that. Belgium is an example. The Netherlands, we're likely to see this next month in terms of when you have a very fragmented party system, all of a sudden it just becomes a lot harder to find a stable coalition. The same thing is Germany. You know, what's going to happen in the next German election? How easy is it going to be with a more fragmented parliament to find a coalition, to form a coalition? But once the coalition is formed, we also found that, so this is a sort of simple survival model where the top line is where you have a low seat share of challenger parties, and the bottom dashed line is where you have a high seat of challenger parties. And what you see is that generally governments survive for more days, longer when you have a lower seat of challenger parties. So it's not only that it's harder to form governments, it's also a little bit harder to stay together. And again, we have many examples of where challenger parties have brought governments down, partly also because remember that second part of their innovation, that rhetorical innovation, which is anti-establishment rhetoric. It's very hard to keep up an appeal. I mean, Donald Trump, not that I want to talk about him, but Donald Trump is an example of he kept it going despite being the establishment. But generally, it's quite hard for parties to keep on being anti-establishment once they're in power. Now, what about the other side? It's not only about government efficiency, democracy, they're also about representation. Ultimately, that's what parties are. They represent the voters. And we try to sort of see, can we look at that empirically? And what we found is that when there are more challenger parties, and also when voters have challenger parties they can vote for, there tends to be a greater feelings of representation and greater feelings that there's more choice. They also seem to have a mobilizing effect. So in the book, we looked at that in different ways. One little example that I also published in an article with Julian Hörner is an example here of the mobilization of the AfD in German regional election, where we looked at how in German regional election are scheduled in a particular calendar, so it's not like but when the AfD was formed and when it started standing in these regional elections, we did see that turnout went up. And one explanation for that, in particular amongst right-wing voters, and one explanation for that could be that all of a sudden there was a party that mobilized them to turn out. Now, so perhaps it has an effect of greater feelings of representation and a mobilizing effect on otherwise disaffected voters. However, interestingly, and this is something one could study more, it doesn't seem to have a positive effect on satisfaction with democracy. So it doesn't mean that voters are necessarily become more satisfied with democracy because there are more challenges. Maybe partly because a lot of these successful challenges are quite negative about democracy. So that's certainly something that one could think more about. So that's, again, I guess we were sort of a bit of a mixed bag that also represented your responses to whether or not this is good or bad for democracy. Another thing to then consider in terms of that broader question is where are we going from here then? And here it's not clear, partly in the sort of if there's always this struggle between dominance and innovation, you can just say, well, you have new dominance. A new set of dominant parties like we've seen in Greece, for example. And so we don't actually have a sort of permanent change. Now, so there's a couple of three scenarios that we put up in the book. One is one of fragmentation, and I think it's very likely that will continue to happen. And some of that have to do with this weakening of the oligopoly. The underlying attachment to parties is just not as strong and probably won't become again as strong as it was in the early post-war period in the 50s and 60s and even 70s. And that means that dominant parties, whatever their flavor, will always have less market power, and there will always be more scope for voters to come in with new ideas and issues. And that's, we call this, although this is misspelled, I'm very sorry to my Dutch co-author, but this has been called the Dutchification, this idea that we all become a bit more like the Netherlands, where we have 1 million parties, none of which get more than sort of 20% of the vote. The other thing is this replacement idea. Yeah, so maybe you just have challenger parties overtaking the market position of the previous dominant parties. So we call this the PASOKification, because PASOK used to be the big center-left party in Greece, and now we have Syriza as the big center-left party in Greece that have moved gradually away from their very challenger populist positions towards being more mainstream center-left while in government, and also now is the main. So is that just, do we just see these replacement? Or there might be this idea of reinvention, that in fact dominant parties have had a hard time, mainly in the wake of the financial crisis. But what they do is, in fact, that when faced with the electoral successes of challengers, they revive their market power by reinventing themselves, often on the sort of traditional issues that people care about, like, you know, left-right economic issues still really matter. And if they can then come back and that's what potentially we've seen with PSOE in Spain and so on, as a kind of reinvention. So that's, I'm not going to give you an answer, and perhaps we have different trajectories in different European countries, but those are some of the options. So with that, I leave us to discuss some of these issues in more detail.